and therefore exposes in that sense if things work. So if things were working well before the pandemic, the pressure that the pandemic brings about, test that to see how resilient those systems would be. And if things were not working so well before the pandemic, maybe the pandemic merely just exposes how uh, those kinds of systems would kind of break down. In
Solani,
some way,
Solani,
sorry.
excuse me for interrupting.
Yeah.
Have you changed the slides? Because we still see the first one.
No, 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 no.
Okay, good, good,
I
good. I
haven't
just wanted to
changed.
make sure because I saw some messages. People were wondering. So, but that's
Uh-huh.
fine. Okay.
Okay.
Then
Okay. No, no,
just,
no, no. I will try and remember to move
yeah,
with the slides.
yeah, just let us know when, maybe the first time you change slide, you can just let us know so that we can see if it's working because sometimes it's only changing for you, but not for the rest of us. So
Uh-huh.
just when you change the slide, just say so. And
Yeah.
if it doesn't change for us, I'll just let you know.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just saying that maybe one of the things that I get from the pandemic is that it kind of tested if systems were working and how systems were working, and sort of lays bare what otherwise appears routine and mundane and banal in certain instances. But in this case, the idea of survival as a concept relates to not necessarily surviving the pandemic, but how to sort of continue with people's livelihood strategies at an economic level in the time of the pandemic. So this is counterintuitive because if you say, well, I know that the pandemic is ongoing right now, but I have to survive, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that because if you were to venture outside, for example, and catch the virus, maybe you die, and maybe that's not really survival, isn't it? So the logic here is a little bit counterintuitive, uh, but it relates to how many people found the circumstances around the pandemic kind of uncertain to fully comprehend, uh, and therefore act on their lives in the ways that they used to do. And here I want to say that at the beginning you will see a lot of this. Uh, can everybody see this next slide here? Yes. Um, so there's a lot of empirical information that I will share here, but that it simply underlines this idea that I've been saying that for many people, talking about survival as not surviving the pandemic, but survival as economic survival, is really about the fact that the pandemic introduces something to them that is a little bit more uncertain, and that for them it is difficult to act on this uncertainty, and people would rather confront what they are used to, confront what how they're used to sort of lead their lives, and really not pay so much attention to what the pandemic has brought about, because this is for them too uncertain to fully comprehend. And you get this from, for example, this quotation where this guy says, "I can say this satanic thing affected a lot of things," and so on and so forth. And by reference to the supernatural and to the sort of evil, he's communicating precisely this sort of uncertainty, this lack of comprehension of what's going on, and therefore it kind of and I think this is the way, in many ways, this is how many people sort of found the pandemic, how they experience it. That to them it introduces a lot of uncertainty, which they don't know what to do with, and they would rather revert to what they're used to. But the main reason for this was that in Southern Africa, maybe not in Sweden as such, but perhaps in many other countries, including China, there was a phase in which everything was just shut down. And for many people, just sitting at home waiting things out became unbearable, both psychologically but also economically. Southern Africa economies are quite significantly informalized, and people sort of eke out livelihoods on the streets. Perhaps this is also the case in many other African countries. And for them to just sit down and do nothing was to sort of force them into some kind of serious economic catastrophe, which is brought on by the pandemic, but also is because now everything about how they sort of support themselves has been disrupted at a quite significant level. And so people start to talk about how they want to negotiate the system and how they want to maneuver the system as a way of just trying to survive. And I think the broader background to this is uh, how mobility sort of proceeds in Southern Africa in historical context. And here we see that Southern Africa exhibits a contradiction in policy and practice on migration governance. And this is because while economic policy frameworks in in the region reflect this sort of neoliberal benefits of migration approaches to migration, the reality is that the region is a region of unfree movement. Mobility across the borders is seriously restricted, and people constantly have to sort of find ways to circumvent these restrictions as a matter of routine. I've written a little bit myself about this, and here I reflect that flexible and uncertain forms of legal protection for migrants only really help the management of accumulation and exploitation strategies as a regulatory norm. And what you see is that there is always a kind of formal and informal system of mobility governance working side by side. And have argued previously that this is geared towards the management of a vulnerable migrant labor force. And these strategies, for example, the restrictions will work to a certain point where there's simply too many people without documents, and then the governments will try and offer blanket amnesty to these undocumented people in order to bring them into the realm of the documented. And this keeps going on and on and on. And you see that this is really just a way of trying to sort of balance accumulation strategies and benefiting from cheap migrant labor from the rest of the region, specifically within South Africa in this case, which is the sort of focal point of a lot of this mobility. So, as I was talking, and this is what I was saying earlier, to say that the kind of pressure that is brought on by the pandemic really tests how things have already been working. And this is what one of the participants says here, to say that the government, and here he's talking about the South African government, the government is always negative about migration, migrants, and the African continent. And to some participants, at least to this participant, the pandemic was an opportunity for them to actually be a little bit more restrictive and to test how restrictive they can go with enforcing their borders. Uh, uh, and he says that maybe these things had become relaxed to some degree before the pandemic. And so the pandemic was a good excuse to say, let's now be a little bit hard on the migrants. And so I was, when he continues, he says that the governments in the region were merely focused on being as restrictive as they could be. And I mean, on the surface, this seems to have sort of been in accord with the restrictions that appeared in the rest of the world. But in Southern Africa, it felt like these restrictions did not really have any support to back them, to make the lives of ordinary people bearable. So, for example, if you shut down people in their homes and not offer them any assistance, that is like really imprisoning them. So people were feeling like, these restrictions were there to punish the people. And then, of course, the emergence of informal systems was a way of making or lessening that punishment. Yeah. Um, and then someone actually mentions it and say the pandemic kind of exposes what already exists in terms of how certain things work. And if things were not working, the pandemic really made them worse. And my intervention, therefore, along these lines is that this sort of informalization of mobility, where people have to rely on themselves and kind of subsidize how government and formal systems of governance work, is more or less similar to this routinization of crisis that Bembe and Reutemann talk about in this article that I shared with you. And that you could see how this applies within the context of informal cross-border mobility. So what now takes place under the pandemic is really an acceleration, putting all of these things under pressure and to see and to uncover and see how clearly they actually function. So we could instead of talking about informal cross-border mobility and how people sort of rely on their own resources to support themselves, to move around and so on and so forth. And then they were called upon even during the pandemic to do this, to be under lockdown, but also to keep supporting themselves, even though they had lost their livelihoods. We kind of see how people live under a kind of constant, everyday sort of crisis mode, if we put it that way. Yeah. Um, so the question would be, in what ways really could we say that informal mobility reflects a kind of routinized crisis? I've already touched on this a little bit to say that there generally exists an overlap between formal and informal regulatory regimes that ration opportunities in line with different calculations. And in some ways, what that might mean is that legal status and documentation are not reliable predictors of migration outcomes in Southern Africa. A lot of people have written about this and seem to agree that this might be the case. But that maybe we should look at relationships that are built around economic survival to more closely sort of explore and understand the intentions and actions of less privileged migrants in that sense. So the restrictions around the pandemic, they kind of quite easily mapped onto this containment development doctrine, which is being pushed especially from Europe in the present, and which is really about controlling mobility and trying to make people stay where they are instead of moving as they often do. Um, in Southern Africa, this succeeded in only disrupting a lot of people's livelihood strategies built around more mobility and generated new survival-related uncertainties and vulnerabilities. Um, are we doing okay in terms of time? So I could continue for what, another 15 to 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Um, okay. So it was a crisis, right? No one knew what it was and to what extent it was going to stay with us. I mean, people at first were happy to just go home and be with their loved ones. except the lockdowns never ended. And people started to really starve and worry how they were going to survive. And eventually, what people were saying was that if I'm afraid of the corona pandemic and then end up dying of hunger, then what is the difference? So that for many people, no matter how serious the pandemic became and how it was, the uncertainty, restrictions, especially the lockdowns, led people to wonder how long they're going to just sit at home and end up dying of hunger. And if they were to die of hunger, what use is it to sort of try and avoid the pandemic? So instead of keeping people at home, the pandemic ended up making people to actually, brave it out and actually just go out. Um, and this sort of follows on to, therefore, this whole discussion about what crisis is, which Mbembe and Reutemann do so well. And what we get from that is that social action does not follow prior intention, but rather judicious opportunism. And we can observe this in this study, both at individual as well as broader social levels, which is to say what individuals and groups end up doing and experiencing ultimately represents something else other than just the fulfillment of their initial intentions. Um, there's also these two quotations here, which I like, which also kind of relate to this how societies seem to function under this lockdown, which a lot of people found quite unbearable. Uh, So during the different lockdown levels, the more restrictive the level was, initially people felt like, well, there was less movement, there was less mobility. People were simply at home. And then he quickly changes and says, but yeah, well, this is in relative terms because there was also an informal system working in parallel with the formal system. So you never really knew if by being more restrictive, that meant that people were not moving. Um, because while people were being locked down, there were groups of individuals, private and those that were working for the state, that were actually busy assisting people to continue with mobility and evade formal regulatory systems. And uh, and this second quote also is very interesting in that this guy says, if you needed to travel under lockdown, you should have money. But obviously, a lot of people already didn't have that money. But he says that as long as you had the money, it didn't matter what the restrictions were and what they were geared towards. You could go wherever you wanted and come back. Because eventually, under the pandemic, this is what really mattered at the end. If you had money, you could be able to do whatever you want. And you could forget about all the rules that were in place to try and contain the spread of the pandemic. So in my view, the pandemic kind of represents a recalibration or a layering of one crisis over this everyday crisis that Mbembe and Reutemann talk about, which brings on a further disorientation and fragmentation of individual and collective identities, leading to sort of further lack of meaning of experience due to new contradictions and uncertainties. And what this does is that it challenges people's sense of self and what roles they were playing in society. But it also meant that what one sees and experiences, what is in place to sort of govern society, and what it actually means eventually became even more misaligned. What you would see could quite easily mislead you. Appearances were misleading in that sense. Yeah. And what does this then does is that it pushes people to adjust in certain ways and normalizes new behaviors. In the context of the pandemic, this might mean that migrants suffer the effects of the pandemic, but they themselves begin to perpetuate these effects. For example, not observing social distancing, faking COVID-19 testing certificates and things like this. And what this does, therefore, it brings further uncertainty where there is more improvisation, more circumvention, more negotiation, and so on and so forth. Obviously, this also relates to more forms of physical and symbolic forms of violence, like fear, anxiety, and helplessness. And how people respond to this, well, I wasn't really sort of following too much whether this represents a kind of resistance or things like this, but basically how people make sense of themselves within this situation, how they cope with these new realities by being dismissive, sometimes cynical, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Uh, and there's a broader discussion, therefore, that this opens up. Hopefully, we have time for it. Because Nicholas Digenova also touches on it in one of the articles that I shared, where he talks about dead time in relation to these kinds of restrictions, particularly maybe the lockdown being a prime example, where he talks about deceleration. But obviously, what he is referencing there in the background is all these ideas around who actually owns time, who actually authors time, who actually in society decides how things happen and what tempo those things follow. Um, in that sense, there's a kind of deeper or broader theoretical and methodological discussion that can be had about the various responses, perceptions of contestations around the pandemic that can be highlighted. And I keep coming back to this that perhaps the lockdown and the phased reopening of mobility is a good example of how institutions presume to regulate time and also in that sense how individuals experience temporality. There is an interesting article on this which sort of tries to make us understand that the pandemic and contestation, and this is my view, that time, especially maybe within the context of the pandemic that we're talking about, that time is not a backdrop for politics, but is a deeply political dimension in itself. And what this means is that, as I have been saying, states and other governance institutions always attempt to sort of wait, yes, to regulate social life through narratives of progress anchored in this idea of empty, homogeneous time. And usually this is done to render events governable and legible in that sense. And so there is always this contestation around who controls time. Um, but in any case, institutions that seek to control or author time have to contend with a multiplicity of temporalities, and their pretensions on the ability to control time are always met with different kinds of contestation and resistance. And so different political actors are always fighting over temporary frameworks. In our case, we could say that the corona restrictions were contested around a new kind of temporal regime, which had to do with what Hassan has called network time. And this relates to the advent of these network-based digital technologies, which have sort of multiplied the sources from which information come and how people sort of respond to their present. Um, and in this case, this has been interesting because in the midst of all of this uncertainty during the pandemic and how people sort of position themselves within it, you see how the use of technologies helps people to maneuver, as they say, the systems, but also to try and counter the most severe effects of some of these lockdowns. Um, One person here says, before COVID, I almost felt that there was a relaxation towards of sort of digitalizing a lot of things. Uh, when you go to the border now versus the time before the virus, you almost feel that there was a bit of automation that was forced as a result of the pandemic because people didn't want to get closer to each other. And so in the Southern African case and how sort of enforcement was managed during the pandemic, there was this push towards digitalization, which was not maybe immediately obvious before. The question of whether this was deliberate or not, the sort of reluctance to digitalize things, maybe it's moot at the moment, but it might also actually quite relate to how formal institutions and other institutions of governance try to sort of control the power over time, over how things happen in general. But then you see here that during the pandemic and how people were sort of put under all kinds of pressure to survive. One guy here says, I am in IT. In other words, I work within IT. I would draft my own COVID-19 certificates for me to be able to travel because I was not able to pay the around 35 US dollars for each certificate that was needed each time one was traveling, on top of having to hike and pay more money. So this guy ended up sort of drafting his own certificates and also making certificates for other people. And that this also became a business. So while also, pretending to be adhering to the COVID-19 restrictions, you could see that if people didn't have the resources to do this, they sort of found their own ways to do this. And so there's this contestation around who actually authors time, who actually authors how things happen around the COVID pandemic, and that different people sort of take things into their own hands and attempt to make things work with the resources that they're left with. And and this quotation, I think the third one here, the success of any regulation in any country does not depend on brute force or the kind of restrictive enforcement that was related to COVID-19. But it would be related, he says, to the cooperation of ordinary people, which is to say that people then we could think about a, a kind of community responsibility towards who authors time in this sense. There's a kind of broader discussion on this, but the essence of it would be that the COVID-19 period therefore seems to uncover a kind of chronopolitical crisis in this sense, which relates to the collision of different temporal regimes and scales. And it underscores some of these facts about chronopolitics, some of which are the fact that the human experience fragments in multiple ways, and it affects our sense of identity, political agency, and temporalities. And that because of this new temporal regime, which maybe formal institutions are no longer fully in control of, and maybe were never really fully in control of, um, notions of progress are no longer really linear. Maybe they never really were. Um, you know. Um, oh, sorry. And that the uncertainties that arose from the pandemic restrictions also relate to this whole idea of nested journeys. And this relates to, I mean, if Dijanova and others talk about deceleration, you see that in some instances, and from these quotations, there are also notions of acceleration in different ways. Um, instead of movement slowing down a little bit, in fact, it actually picks up in some instances. If certain restrictions are meant to kind of control how people move, these are contested in ways that make people do certain things not according to how official institutions or institutional frameworks expect them to work. So there's a lot of slowing down, a lot of acceleration, a lot of diversions and things like this. This whole idea around nested journeys. And this idea of temporal governance is also brought to the fore, where these dichotomies between circled people and migrants, the documented and the illegal, they are sort of up in the air, because as we said, documents do not really reflect. You you cannot get your conclusion or your sense of what's going on by looking at documents alone, as we often do in maybe these parts of the world. Or so the argument goes. I'll try to maybe go through this slide, which hopefully is the last one. I think it is. Uh, so what about uncertainty, vulnerability, and necropolitics? I know I mentioned something about necropolitics, which I haven't really touched. Maybe I touched indirectly, but I can just sort of go over that quickly now here to say that the pandemic did not expose migrants to conditions of slow violence and social death, but it actually made this more visible and multiplied its processes. Um, the processes that link necropolitics to accumulation involve kind of putting people in a kind of routinized crisis of vulnerability and precarity as a process of capitalistic accumulation, including how informal processes subsidize and substitute for formal institutional responsibility for individuals and communities. Um, and in the specific case of COVID restrictions in Southern Africa, necropolitics could be read as being about the imposition of severe restrictions without absorbing the economic costs, as well as keeping migrants in conditions of injury and neglect as a way of nursing the system of accumulation, uh, even under severe public shocks brought about by the pandemic. And I think we saw this everywhere that the those in severe precarity, frontline staff, people who work in healthcare here in Europe and elsewhere, these people were the ones who became most exposed to the pandemic uh, because they are the most profitable for capital, but they are also the most expendable. If they were the ones who could be dying more, the system maybe is designed that should be the case. I think I'll stop here. I don't know how coherent my talk was, but I'm still processing these ideas and working through a manuscript that I'm preparing at the present. But thank you for your attention, and yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Xolani. Very punctual and very interesting presentation. Also, thank you for introducing the concept of time in this lecture series. Time, as many of you know, has become increasingly important in migration studies. So I think this was a very nice introduction of that concept as well. So thanks a lot. We're going to take a very, very short break of 5 minutes. And during that time,